Hello, I'm Onyekachi Wambu, a Ford's Executive Director, introducing the first of an occasional series of Return of the Icon podcast. The podcast will interrogate issues around the restitution of African artifacts and human remains in British cultural institutions. Good morning. This is the first of the Return of the Icons podcast, and we're really fortunate to have with us today Neil Curtis, who's Head of Museums and Special Collections at the University of Aberdeen. Neil studied archaeology, museum studies and education, and his interests have focused on Scottish historiography, particularly relating to collecting and exhibitions and the social role of museums today. This has included work on repatriation, human remains, and working with originating communities. He's also a member of the Museum Association Ethics Committee, Society of Antiquarians of Scotland Committees, University Museums in Scotland, and the Scottish Museums Recognition Committee, and a member of the working groups on decolonisation and repatriation of the Museums Association and of the Museums Galleries Scotland. So, Neil, thank you very much for talking with us. Neil and his institution, Aberdeen, have been in the news recently with a dramatic announcement about returning one of the fabled Benin bronzes to Benin. So, Neil, I just wanted to find out, how did Aberdeen acquire the bronze initially?
Yes, it goes back to 1957 when it was bought at auction. I think it was in Sotheby's in London. And that's actually quite unusual for the university, that most of the collections are actually ones that were given by graduates or staff or so on. And so we've usually got quite a close connection with where they were collected. This was unusual that it had gone through the art market and it was bought. There was a period in the sort of middle of the 20th century when that was the sort of thing that museums did. And I think the curator here was interested in art. And so I think viewed this as an item of African art to sit alongside art from elsewhere in the world.
Okay, well, and in terms of the department itself, that was now looking after this item, can you tell us a little bit about the history of the department and any precedents that there may have been for return that you were working?
Yeah. I mean, the university's museums are really among the oldest in Scotland. We've got, records of museums back into the 18th century and a continuous story from the late 18th century of having museums. And I think it reflects what the graduates did. So they went and traveled around the world, they collected things. Those are simple words to say, traveled and collected. We can probably come back to that later. And then they gave their collections to the university. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the collections are sort of sorted into an anthropological museum. And this was by the then professor of anatomy. And so he very much was part of that world that saw cultural anthropology, archaeology, and anatomy all as the study of humanity. And at its heart, I think in many ways, was the body and race. And so there were, human remains collected and displayed in the Anatomy Museum to show the physical reality of race, in scare quotes. And then in the Anthropological Museum, which was upstairs, it was displayed almost as a walk around the world. You could see things from all parts of the world. And that, I think, showed the way that the students and the staff were able to travel around the world and see everything, while the rest of the world stayed metaphorically in its glass cases. So that's the sort of background to it. And it's therefore, the more you look at it, the more you think about it, the more sort of interesting and troubling all those stories are. That how things were collected, how they were displayed, how they were ordered, and also often how little, the museum staff know about what things really meant to the people who they came from. So my first experience of repatriation was back in, I think it was 2003, when we were contacted by members of the Horn Society of the Blood Tribe, the Kainai Nation in Canada. And they had traced a sacred bundle to the university collection, and they were asking for its return to put it back into ceremonial and traditional use as part of cultural rejuvenation. So at that point, I had to create a procedure for, how do you respond to something? How do you have a discussion? So we drafted a procedure, we went through that, and we were able to return that to them, basically in the early summer of the following year. So it was a fairly speedy process. And it was an amazing thing to go through, because I really came to understand so much more about how they valued this as a sacred item, not as a museum artifact. And so our return was unconditional, and it went back into use. And indeed, they invited me to the Sundance the following year so that I could really understand the impact of what we've done. And when I saw it being worn, being danced, it was much shorter than it was when it left Aberdeen, because they'd cut a bit off it, because that's the appropriate way of looking after it. It's not how a museum would do it, but it's the right way of doing it, in its traditional use. So that's been, in a sense, the basis of what we've done since. And we've not had many requests for repatriation. And I think maybe various reasons for that. We can maybe talk about that later. But certainly we have a procedure, and we've gone through it a couple more times. And so that's the background to why we then were thinking about the rest of the collection and whether we should be a bit more proactive.
When you saw them sort of shorten that dress, and in terms of how they were using it, I mean, were you conflicted? I mean, there's a part of you that has gone through training as a museum curator about preservation. I mean, what did you feel about that? I know you handed it back on conditionally, but you're also human, aren't you?
Yeah, I don't know. In all honesty, I mean, it was so wonderful to see it back being used as it should be, and the honor of them taking me there to see that was phenomenal. So I didn't have mixed feelings that, I mean, a previous me before all of that in abstract might have thought that, but going through it in reality and, meeting people and talking to people, understanding people, that, it was completely straightforward. I wasn't conflicted.
What I'm interested in also is how it begins another journey and a new story. So, and in a way, you're not, the museum, Aberdeen, do not in control of that. They are now reasserting that, and a new narrative will emerge after it's been returned. When you considered the returning the Benin bronzes, had there been an approach from Nigeria at all, or any of the stakeholders in Nigeria? I mean, you mentioned that there have been very few requests. Had there been a request from the Nigerians?
Yeah, I mean, looking back through, archives, there was a letter from Bernie Grant in the 1990s when he was contacting museums all over the UK, basically just finding out what there was the first step, and that was as far as it seemed to go with Aberdeen. There doesn't seem to be, he didn't initiate a request with Aberdeen at that point. Okay. And after that, there was no contact. So that bit of the story really, this is where we didn't have a particular request. I think what is clear though is that, we were not living in isolation in Aberdeen. I mean, what's going on in the rest of the world, you hear what other people are talking about. And so it was, I think it doesn't need to be a request to you to realize that something's wanted.
Right. And when you were looking at the options, I mean, it seems to be been largely an internally driven process. When you were looking at the options, what were the ones that you considered for in terms of discussing the return? Was it always going to be on the model of the Native American one, or were there other options on the table?
Well, I think we have, I mean, our process is open-ended, so it doesn't have a series of predetermined options. And the way that we set up an advisory group to consider it, and that draws people together from across the university. So particularly, academic staff with expertise. So for the Benny Bronze, we had somebody who is Nigerian, who's teaches economics. We had an anthropologist who's got experience in repatriation. We've historian of West Africa and history of slavery. We also involved somebody from another museum in Scotland, so Steph Schalton from the Hunterian in Glasgow, and then a representative of the claimant. And that's really important. And that's the key thing there, I think, is that it meant that that group was able to have a really open discussion around what all of this meant, what the history was, what would happen if it was returned, if it was not returned, what the significance is to the university, significance to the claimant. So our criteria are about setting that discussion rather than saying there are options that must be followed. And so it's out of that discussion comes what seems to be the best thing that we can do.
And in terms of that decision, it was about returning it without any conditions attached.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's because where I think going back to that previous example I talked about with the Kainai, there the main driver was the sense of cultural rejuvenation, and this is what mattered, was getting it back so they could use it because it mattered so much to them, and this was a sacred item to them. So although we did talk about how it was acquired, that wasn't a critical part of the discussion. Whereas with the Benin Bronze, really the focus of the discussion was how this was acquired, and the sacking of Benin City, the looting of all the items, meant that we felt that we didn't have moral title to it. I mean, we did have legal title, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to return it. I mean, that legal title enables you to return it. So so that was the critical part of the discussion there, rather than thinking about what would happen subsequently. That was the important bit. So every discussion is different.
Right. And beyond that working group, how did you then build the broader consensus within Aberdeen for the Board of Trustees and others to then agree to the unconditional return?
I mean, I think
and I'm asking this because I think a lot of people are now looking at you as a great example, a model for how to do this.
I mean, I think one thing is that we had that history, going back, that we had previously repatriated something from the collection, and it was seen to have been a good thing to do. So there was quite a bit of background knowledge that that's one of the things that the museums do. We look after the collections for a purpose, and sometimes that purpose is returning them. So I think there's that background. We, of course, before making that first contact, I met with the university principal and we talked about it. So, I wasn't being a sort of, rogue agent doing something. We had that institutional support. I think the other bit is that the university's just gone through a strategic planning exercise, and we've now a strategic plan for the next 20 years. So it's quite a long-term one, and it highlighted values. And so, the values of being, sustainable and international and inclusive. And then we have a foundational purpose, which looks back at the original foundation of the university in 1495, but in more modern language. And that's about, says it's open to all in the pursuit of truth in the service of others. So what we were talking about completely aligned with the university's values as expressed in its strategic plan, that there'd been a lot of staff discussion as that plan was discussed. And so, the pursuit of truth, I felt, was critical in this, that, we had to, reveal the story of how that came to be in Aberdeen. And then the reason we have it is in the service of others. So who are the appropriate others? So I think it aligned so well with other things that we were doing. We weren't trying to make a particular political statement. We were trying to follow through existing values that I think are fairly straightforward. And so it was striking that when we obviously had this panel that considered it in detail, and the report was then written to the senior management team at the university. who completely supported it, and then they passed it on to the university court, the governing body, who again supported it. So I think that building up over a long time, the sense of this is one of the things the museum's for, and having those institutional values and bringing them together.
Okay, thanks. And then just in terms of, once you then make the decision and you make the announcement, obviously the announcement is made inside of a context now of culture wars and, lots of demands being made and actions being taken abroad that are quite progressive in Germany, but quite a bit of resistance in the UK from various institutions. Were the university and were you surprised by the response to the announcement?
Basically not, because we're aware of what's going on. I think what pleased me was that we didn't play into the culture wars particularly, that it was actually, and I think that was where our emphasis on the truth and just, and not making grand statements about it. We did something, that was a decision that was logical. Rather than a political grandstanding statement. And I think that's really important. So I was very pleased to see, in some ways actually, how the social media response, the media response generally was, supportive, but not too excited. It was sensible. And I think that's what's really important is, what we've done is a logical, sensible thing to do. It's in some ways nothing special.
Right. Having made the decision, you'd now need to reach out to the Nigerian stakeholders. How did that go, and how have those conversations gone, and what's the current status?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I find myself slightly conflicted in this, because on the one hand, I feel that what's really important is that we do the right thing and return to the right people. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, well, hang on, is it for me to judge? And really, this is a discussion that needs to take place, in Nigeria, in Benin City, about what is the right thing to do. So the tricky thing for me, therefore, is trying to, make the offer, encourage the discussion, but not determine it. And I think it's. The logic of our decision was that we didn't have moral title, so therefore we don't have the right to pick and choose who we'd like to give it to. We've just got to give it back to the right people. But how do you do that? So it is quite difficult logically. I mean, aside from anything about politics, logically making that decision is easy, but following it through is much harder. I mean, we were able to get in touch with somebody in Nigeria, Professor Bankole Sodipo, and so he's been talking to the various parties, and so we were able to, when we discussed the return, we discussed a claim that came from the Nigerian federal government, supported by the National Museums and Monuments Commission and the Edo State Governor, and critically the Governor, the Royal Court of the Oba. So I felt that we therefore in a position where we're saying we're not going to get it wrong, because we're, all the people that might have a claim are talking together. Where we are now is, not for me, that, that's now in their court, they're now discussing the details of the legality of who signs which bit of paper and in which order, and when will it be transferred and how will it be transferred and so on. But that really is something I feel is now, we are now responding to that, having made the decision to hand it over. We're now not an active agent in it at all.
Is there a projected time frame that you hope to conclude all of that, or is it pretty much open-ended?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, it's not for us to set a timescale.
Okay.
So whatever our Nigerian partners decide on as appropriate is the timescale we'll follow, as much as we can. Obviously, there's the additional problem of COVID just now, but it's not our timescale, we're not setting it.
Yeah, and that will, as part of this process, just include the full transfer of the legal ownership of IP rights and everything.
That's the idea. I mean, I think, you know, those are all things that, you know, we have to discuss and sign and agree. But I mean, what we are assuming is that as it goes, any information, and as you say, the rights to any images in it, I'd, you know, assume that they transfer as well. I mean, I'd like to be able to license back the right to use some of the images, so that for our historical records and our exhibitions about what the museum's done, will be good to have those images. But basically, it is about transferring power and decision making.
And would that include the full kind of narrative of what happened to it while it was with you and even prior? So any catalogue information that you might have and research about.
Yeah, I mean, we one of the striking things, of course, is we do not have much. I mean, this is one of the issues, is because of the way in which they were looted. The individual stories of, you know, these items, you know, prior to 1897, really was damaged at the same time that, you know, the items were damaged and the city destroyed. I mean, that was destruction of more than just things, destruction of people and ideas and knowledge. So we actually know remarkably little, and we had to, as part of the discussion about returning, we had to commission a bit of research to find out. We didn't have a copy of the 1957 catalogue to know how it was acquired, so we had to do that. And we fortunately we discovered that there had been an exhibition, I think in 1927, and the advert for the exhibition featured a photograph of the one that, you know, came to Aberdeen, and so that was the evidence that made it. We were able to tie it clearly to the 1897 looting, that we're not just talking about something from Benin City, we're talking about clearly it had that historical link. So all that information, yes, goes, but I think, you know, as you've alluded to before, there are multiple narratives, and, you know, we don't curate the sole narrative. There are other ones, many of which we won't be aware of, but we're not going to sort of try to hang on to anything secretively. I mean, I will have my story to tell. I'm telling it just now, and I will continue to have that story. But other people will have theirs.
With Native American headdress, have you kept in touch with them, or have you co-developed programs together, or was it a handover and, you know, they got on with it in that spirit that you say, unconditional, and it was for them to then decide what they did with it? Or have you developed I guess news stories about how it's being used, or, you know, is there an ongoing relationship, in other words?
Sort of, you know, yes and no. I think the important thing, I think, was we returned it to them, and therefore it was up to them to decide what they did. So we've not, you know, there's no formal agreement they have to report to us. We don't need to know what's happening since. That's up to them. I mean, I was delighted that we were given a sort of semi-precious stone. It's a fossil ammonite, was given by somebody from the Kainai to us as, you know, a memento for what we had done. We also, I had contacted the man who was keeping it after it was returned. He contacted us and ordered a Bonnie Prince Charlie kilt jacket, because he wanted to wear this when dancing the headdress to remember the time that it had spent in Scotland. So. And I've met people since, but we don't have a formal ongoing relationship. And I actually think sometimes that's very problematic, because I think sometimes museums can think that a successful repatriation is one that creates this ongoing relationship and partnership and so on. And that might or might not be appropriate. If it happens, great. But I think there are other things, you know, like those examples I've just given, where there are traces that are left in the memory, and we think about each other, but we're not needing to, you know, that horrible word, operationalize it. It's about, you know, natural human contact and stories developing, and we have our own stories that refer to each other, and I think that's much more important.
Some people have talked about, you know, just in terms of replacing the gap that will be there with so there's been talk about replicas. I mean, would you be happy with accepting a replica from Benin, so that the story continues in a way, or and then others have been exploring long-term loans. Well, what are your feelings about those kind of different options? I mean, you've gone very unequivocally for this kind of unconditional return.
Yeah.
What do you feel about some of those other options?
I mean, I think all these are options. I think it depends so much on what we're talking about. So if we're talking about the Benin bronzes, then I felt for us we were talking about something that we didn't have moral title to. Therefore, it wouldn't be for us to demand anything. However, I can see that we could ask for, we could be offered things a bit like saying these ongoing relationships. I mean, and I could see in other discussions, and maybe not about the Benin bronzes, but temporary loans, long-term loans. I mean, like we do around between museums, and I think I mean, I suppose specifically with the Benin bronzes, I think that they're a bit like Egyptian antiquities, that there's a huge advantage to Egypt in having material in museums all over the world. I mean, even straightforwardly economically for the tourism industry, it's really beneficial to Egypt to have material elsewhere. But I think the important bit is we're starting thinking about who owns, who decides, who has power in those relationships, and making that much more balanced. And I think in the case of the Benin bronze, we're shifting the decision making. So it could be that we would borrow something. It could be that we would be able to have a replica or an image and so on, but that's got to be part of a discussion, not a demand.
Yeah. You also have the advantage that obviously the museum, the university is a standalone institution, and you're not bound by the current laws that impact the national museums, and so you can, in a way, express that moral state, make that moral position that you took. How have you been approached by other museums, regional museums, and others who are not bound by the national laws, who are looking to make similar returns? And is Aberdeen now seen as a great model for this? And how are you beginning to, if I was doing sort of programmatic work, I'll talk about developing a toolkit for return. Are you beginning to do that in a way?
I think in a way that that misrepresents what we've done. That we were the first ones to be able to say publicly we've made a decision. There have been, I mean, we took 2 years of discussion in the background to partly actually just to establish who to talk to, and to make that decision. And many museums are in the same sort of position, all at different stages, having different conversations. So I think there's not that we are first is a fluke rather than anything else. So I think there's a lot of consensual discussion going on in museums about repatriation generally, and then specifically about the Benin bronzes. I think it's risky to portray it as it sometimes looks from the outside, like a competition, like a race or something.
Yeah.
The sort of mention a toolkit, and it's not a word I'm terribly keen on, but I am quite pleased with our process and procedure, and the way that we have our database of all the collection is online. So if anybody is interested in it for whatever reason, they can look at it. I'm not going to start judging. Oh, you might want it back, therefore I'm going to keep it secret. And so that trying to make that information available is open to all idea. But I think a procedure that tries to have what we call educative criteria rather than prescriptive ones, that don't set up rules that you must, hurdles you must cross, restricted options that are possible, that try to have that open, thorough, genuine, truthful conversation. And I think the other bit that's really been very valuable is having the claimant, which is another not great word, being involved in the discussion, so that it's not that the claimant has to say, oh, if we get it back, this is what we'll do, and the museum just sits there. You know, the museum also has to say, if this stayed, what would the museum do? If it leaves, what would the museum do? So that we together think out various possible futures. And I think that more consensual discussion is really important. So, you know, if I'm, you know, proselytizing, then I'm trying to encourage other people to have that more consensual approach and have those sorts of criteria and that involvement of people in discussion. I think that's something that I'd like to do. The bit I think I've got to work on is that the procedure that we developed has, and every time we go through a case, we seem to tweak the procedure on the experience of what's happened. And this is the first time that we've gone through one where we've been more proactive, where, you know, the request hasn't come to us. We've gone out and tried to, you know, find the appropriate people to make the request. And that's something I'm not sure yet what the outcome will be, but I'm reflecting on this because I think that we could maybe tweak our procedure slightly to, you know, to make that slightly clearer that we can, within the procedure, follow that, and that includes being more proactive. But I think it basically worked. But I think there might be wee things there. There's also things about language that change. I remember the very first draft we had. I mean, like I say, where museums are all talking to each other, so I borrowed the criteria from other people. I tweaked them, but a lot of it goes back to Glasgow Museum's decision to return the ghost dance shirt. And one of the words that we used initially when talking about the future was talking about the fate of the object. And as we went through, we realized fate, death, is a very negative term. It implies that there's something negative happening as a result of the return, rather than looking at outcomes and futures. So there are things about language, as you reflect on and you use the language, you talk with people, you realize the implications. So the language has shifted over the years, but that it's all, you know, part of that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really struck me was just this sense from your announcement that you're seeing it not as a loss, but as an opportunity to build something new. And, you know, just recasting it in that way, because the arguments are so much kind of framed and, you know, as a loss to Britain, as a loss to these institutions, but it was much more creative, let's say, in terms of how we build a new future.
I mean, I suspect, I mean, this is where, as a university, you know, we are a learning institution. We're looking to, you know, always looking to the future. What can we learn? What can we do differently? How can we benefit people through research and teaching? So that sense all the time of the museum as part of that is, you know, what's the point of having the museum? You know, and it's for the benefit of people and for the benefit of the future. So I think it's, in a sense, it's easier for university museums because of that. And the material is probably seen less as, you know, treasures that we value ourselves because of our ownership of the treasures, and more about how we're using them in teaching and research and public engagement. I think it's easier for universities to think in that way.
Okay, so two final questions. I mean, we've spoken about a lot of the upside of this. Have there been any real challenges or moments when you were pulling your hair out, or as you went along? I mean, it seems to have been very much a very smooth process.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, you know, yeah, I mean, really, you know, this hasn't been terribly difficult. It's been very, very interesting and made me think a lot and made me learn a lot. I mean, I know considerably more about the history of Nigeria and, you know, and Benin than I ever did before. So, as do many other people. So I think that's been tremendous. I think the hardest bit was that initial bit of finding who to talk to, making those first steps towards a relationship. Now, that's me going through this for the first time, and I sort of look back on the claims that we've had from other people in the past, and I think I'm, you know, more empathetic with them. The hurdles of how do you go about talking to people? Who is the right person to talk to? You don't know who they are. How are you going to build that relationship so you can have a good discussion. So, you know, I think I've got more understanding of what it's like to make a claim as a result of going through this. And that certainly, you know, that's been the hardest one, because, you know, Nigeria is, you know, quite far away from Scotland. And so we're, fortunately, it's about the same time zone, which has made conversations much easier than it could have been. But that, I think, has been the hardest, is building those connections and having those conversations. And I mean, during COVID is also not easy, but, you know, basically that's, you know, that's the difficult bit, but that's marginal. It's
And then the final question, Scotland seems to be in the forefront of a lot of the reparations debate. I mean, Glasgow University have made a deal with the University of West Indies, and Aberdeen has, you know, come forward with this unconditional offer to return. Why do you think Scotland is in the forefront of this? Somebody asked me this about Germany. I can really understand that, because they've gone through the process of denazification and trying to deal with their past. And so, but why do you think Scotland is particularly in the forefront of some of this thinking?
I mean, that's a difficult question, and I'm wary of saying Scotland is, because Scotland is 5 million people. So having sort of identifying a sort of national characteristic is always risky. So I'm wary, and it's particularly when you're doing something like this, it's very easy to start claiming a moral high ground. And I'm really wary of that. I mean, I think there are things in Scotland's history that means that it's also suffered from empire and has benefited from empire. So it's a much more conflicted sense of what empire was about. And I think it sometimes can be really productive, but sometimes I'm concerned that it makes it very easy for Scotland to, you know, I say Scotland, people in Scotland, to leap onto the, oh, we're victims too, we're with you, and think, no, actually, hang on, there was huge wealth and advantage came to Scotland as a result of colonisation of the rest of the world. So I think we've got to keep it complicated and keep understanding that it's not simple. And I am really wary about making a claim for Scotland.
But I was looking at, I can't remember the exact name of it, the stone that came back from London.
The Stone of Destiny, yes.
Yeah, the Stone of Destiny. So Scotland itself is making its own claims, and I wondered whether there was something around that. Just,
I mean, I think there are. I mean, I think
understanding loss and.
I mean, I think obviously, you know, Scottish national and political identity is in flux and is in dispute. So items of, you know, national significance have an extra buzz about them. I think it was actually very interesting with the return of the Stone of Destiny, is that was actually done by the government before, the UK government, before they established the Scottish Parliament, actually, I think in some ways in the hope that returning a national symbol would assuage the demands for a parliament. And actually what was striking was how little interest there was in the return of the Stone of Destiny. And I think that showed a change in Scottish national identity over the years, that back in the 1950s, taking a symbol of royalty and history in Scotland was the focus of political demand. By the 1990s, it was a demand for a parliament. And so the return of the stone by the 1990s actually didn't strike in the way that I think it was hoped that it might. So, you know, things change. But I think, you know, I mean, I find, as you said, you know, in your introduction, I am very interested in Scottish historiography. Why is it that Scotland is as it is now? And what are the reasons? And what part does colonisation and empire have in that? It's a very complicated, very fascinating story.
Well, thank you. And I think, you know, for me, the watchword is the narratives change. The narratives around the Stone of Destiny changed. It meant something else after the return from what it meant in the 50s. And there will be, I think, a new story of this bronze when it returns to Nigeria, which I'm really, really keen on following through. So, Neil, thanks so much. We wanted to keep this around 40-45 minutes, which we've done, and we've covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate you sharing the time with Return of the Icons, and again, just wanted to congratulate you and Aberdeen and the institution on having made this decision, and for it to have been as unproblematic as it is. I think sometimes people try and problematize these things too much, and I think you've shown that with determination and a very clear kind of moral agenda that a lot of this can be done very easily. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to think things through more carefully. I mean, it's nice to, after all the media excitement where it's all in very short sentences, it's nice to be able to think more rambly. So thank you.
No, thank you. This is the first of an occasional series of Return of the Icon podcasts, which interrogate issues around the restitution of African artifacts and human remains in British cultural institutions. We hope you've enjoyed it. Look out for future podcasts in the series by going to our website, afford-uk.org, or to the Return of the Icons Facebook page.